So, a little while ago on the channel, we did a video where I attempted to rank what I believed to be the top 10 most overpowered and most broken abilities in all of Bleach. And certainly, while some of the abilities appearing on that list and some of their placements were absolutely up for debate, it seemed to me, when everything was all said and done, when the dust had settled, that the general consensus was that everyone was unanimously pretty happy with my number one pick, meaning that the community as a whole had collectively decided that Yhwach the Almighty was the single most powerful ability in the series to date. And honestly, why wouldn't it be? It's the closest thing to an actual traditional godlike power we've ever seen in Bleach, making its user both all-seeing and all-knowing. And so in today's video, I wanted to dive a little deeper into what the absolute pinnacle of power is in Bleach, Yhwach the Almighty. See what this ability is all about, dissect it a little bit, look at its weaknesses and how it was utilized in the story as a whole. Before we get started, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach videos just like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. It means that hopefully the video will get more exposure on the YouTube algorithm and more Bleach fans like yourselves will get a chance to see it. And if you really like what I do here and you want to take that support for me another step further, I have a Patreon for my channel as well. Now, of course, you don't have to support me over there at all, but if you did decide to, you can get videos like this one early and you can support me over there for as little as $1 a month. All of the names appearing on screen right now are people who are choosing to support me over on Patreon. They're patrons of the channel, and they're helping me do what I love. So thank you all so very much. I really appreciate it. 1,000 years after the defeat and disappearance of the Quincy King Yhwach, the Kaiser Gesang has become little more than an old wives' tale. But for many Quincy throughout the universe of Bleach, it was much more than that. It was a prayer that foretold the second coming of their ancient sealed king, Yhwach. And the Kaiser Gesang notes that in 900 years, the sealed Quincy king will regain his heartbeat, in another 90, his reason, and finally, with a further 9 years, he will regain his full power. And to those Quincy who believe, once this time is up, their 1,000-year prayer is finally being answered. And we get to see this play out through the story of Bleach. Yhwach, the sealed Quincy king that this legendary song speaks of, finally returns to prominence in the 1,000-year Blood War arc of Bleach to wage war against the Soul Society, but more importantly, free his father, the Soul King, of his endless humiliation at the hands of the Shinigami, and remake all three worlds back into that primordial world they once were. During his monumental battle with the leader of the Zero Division Ichibei Hyosobe, Yhwach's power finally returns to him. Hashwolf and Uryu bear witness to the moment those last 9 years finally come to an end and the Kaiser Gesang is fulfilled prophetically before their very eyes. Yhwach's eyes awaken, he gains a second iris in his moment of dire need, and he's finally able to fight with his eyes fully open, meaning he's finally retained the power of a true Quincy. Now, Yhwach finally has regained access to the Almighty, but it's not as though he couldn't use it prior to this. He just chose not to, because if he uses the Almighty before his power has properly returned to him, before he's able to truly open his eyes, there's a great chance, a great risk that he will accidentally steal the powers of all the Quincy in the world, leaving him essentially without an army. Fittingly for one of the characters closest to being a god in the universe of Bleach, the power of the Almighty in its earliest form gives Yhwach the ability to be both all-seeing and all-knowing. He can see all futures laid bare in front of him, and everything used in those futures against him becomes known to him, and therefore no form of countermeasures or defense will matter. Yhwach basically knows how to deal with all abilities put in front of him. This is shown to us immediately as he battles Ichibei Hyosebe. He's able to completely nullify Ichibei's Bankai ability, where he wrote the name Kuroari on Yhwach's body. It just disappears, turning into flakes before turning into dust. Yhwach the Almighty has rendered it utterly useless. Ichibei, however, not willing to go down without a fight, activates perhaps his most powerful ability yet, Futen Tai Satsuryo, where he plans to bury Yhwach within a mausoleum of pure blackness, erasing him from existence entirely and forbidding him to even resurrect. However, Yhwach reveals that he said already he is all-seeing and all-knowing. No abilities will work on him anymore. And he terrifies Ichibei in a very, very cool scene where he finishes Ichibei's sentence for him. Ichibei basically says, prepare yourself to fall into a pitch black hell. But at the same time he says that, Yhwach says it as well, and Ichibei realizes that actually Yhwach has seen everything he's going to do, and Futen Tai Satsuryo is rendered useless and Ichibei is destroyed. This is just the first instance of this absolute godly power being utilized in Bleach to not even its fullest potential, but the leader of the Zero Division is rendered utterly helpless before it, setting the stage for a finale to the Bleach series involving easily the most powerful character we have ever seen to date. The Almighty is already probably the most powerful ability we've ever seen in the series, but Yhwach wasn't even using it to its fullest potential at this point, as he reveals later on that the true power of the Almighty is not just to see the future, but to freely alter it as well. Yhwach reveals that he doesn't just see a linear path before him, but he sees all futures laid out in front of him as though they were grains of sand on the wind, and he can simply see literally every outcome and choose to alter them at his whim. It's pretty obvious why this is unanimously agreed to be the most powerful ability in Bleach, because it does essentially turn the enemy into a god. Someone who is capable of changing the future, changing fate, changing and altering destiny to his will. Anyone could have any ability in the series, but Yhwach would know instantly how to counter it and would have even changed the future to aid him anyway. So really, he basically can't be defeated by a conventional ability. The ramifications for a power like this are obviously colossal, and considering that and considering what we see, I think Kubo barely scratched the surface with the Almighty in general. Now, the power of the Almighty has a fitting progenitor, originating from the Soul King himself, who, outside of his son, really is the absolute closest thing to a god the Bleach universe has ever known, and is revered as such within the lore. And before he was officially introduced in the story, I think many of us wondered exactly what this character was going to be like, what kind of powers might lie dormant at his fingertips, and it really all revolves around this idea of the Almighty. Now, Yhwach mentions that him having multiple irises in his eyes is the symbol of a true Quincy. And the different amounts of irises in eyes is something that gets played up a lot towards the end of the 1,000-Year Blood War, and while it's never really kind of explained exactly how it works, I think it's easy enough to infer. At the absolute top of this hierarchy is the Soul King himself, bearing 4 different irises in both of his eyes. In my opinion, this means that he is the truest form of a Quincy the series has ever known, and easily the most powerful being in all of Bleach. Someone who is just completely above virtually everything else. Like I said, while it's never confirmed, I always thought the number of irises dictated essentially a level of mastery over the Almighty itself. The Soul King is the apex of this, the pinnacle of what someone can achieve, and it explains why his son, who only bears 3 irises in each eye, cannot see his father in his foresight abilities, in his clairvoyance. This is something that's mentioned a number of times. Yhwach is unable to see the Soul King, and also any kind of offshoot of the Soul King as well. For example, Mimihagi escapes Yhwach's gaze as well. So Yhwach is the second most proficient user of the Almighty, having 3 irises in each eye. Then there are characters like Pernida Pankajaz, who I presume has some kind of a way of using this power. Pernida bears 2 irises in its main eye, and of course is literally the left arm of the Soul King itself. In fact, the Soul King's precognition powers seem to be so strong that when Yhwach approaches his father in his throne room, he basically says that he thinks his father has foreseen his death potentially millions of years ago. It seems highly likely that the Soul King can literally see everything through time and space, and as Yhwach mentions, has seen the moment that Yhwach would finally return to being and finish off his father for good. So I mean, already this is quite a lot to take in. We're now suddenly talking about eyes and irises and the ability to see the future millions of years in advance. But that's what a power like the Almighty does to a narrative. And if I have to be totally honest with you guys, I've never really liked this power that much. It felt unnecessarily strong to me, especially when you get into the area where Yhwach can alter the future. It was already powerful enough that he could see the future and know everything, but Kubo takes it another step further and makes it so that defeating this guy feels like an impossibility. Abilities like the Almighty make narratives very messy, I think. They create loopholes, they create paradoxes, they just make things, I think, unnecessarily complicated. But I get exactly what Kubo is going for, and I think actually it makes a lot of sense in the world of Bleach to turn Yhwach into what feels literally like a god, which is these ideas of omnipotence, omniscience, all that sort of thing makes him a true force to be reckoned with. Now, there is one other character who can use the Almighty in the series, that being Yhwach Hashwolf, Sternritter B, the balance and the Grand Master of the Sternritter, but perhaps more importantly, the direct liaison between Yhwach and the rest of the Quincy race, essentially. Hashwolf is in many ways like a vessel for the Almighty's power. It seems like it's so strong to me that even Yhwach himself cannot contain it all the time, and when he falls asleep, that power must be given to another host, and that host is Hashwolf, because Hashwolf is like Yhwach. He's one of these special Quincy that's born once every 200 years or so, who gives power rather than takes it. Now, Yhwach can seemingly do both at will. Literally, he can just give power to someone and rob it back, but Hashwolf seems to be purely about giving strength to other people. The only reason Bazby is as strong as he is because he spent so much time in Hashwolf's vicinity. Now, we know that Hashwolf cannot use the Almighty on the same scale as Yhwach. Hashwolf cannot alter the future, but he can see it and know it, much as Yhwach can as well. And again, this is where things get a little bit fuzzy. I kind of wish that Hashwolf only had 2 irises per eye when he gained this power, because it would lend some credence to the idea that there are different hierarchies of being able to use it. Hashwolf can't alter the future, therefore he's missing an iris. It's also strange as well that Yhwach starts out with 2 irises per eye, and then kind of upgrades to 3 as he defeats Ichibei. I'm not entirely sure what the relevance of that is, because the moment his eyes open is supposed to be the moment he gains his full strength back. So I'm not entirely sure why Kubo suddenly opted to give him a 3rd iris as well, if that was maybe just to be a visual indicator that he is on a completely different plane at this point. I'm really not sure, but I think for simplicity's sake, it would have been nice for Hashwolf to have 1 iris less and continue this hierarchy between Yhwach and the Soul King, but that doesn't happen. So we're faced with this unbelievable power that realistically nobody in the established Bleach universe is really going to be able to stand up to. And yet Kubo devises a number of credible weaknesses for the Almighty. And what's strange to me is that although many of these weaknesses honestly make total sense, which I think is impressive in and of itself, Kubo doesn't elect to actually really make any of them what defeats Yhwach in the end, although I do think that is debatable. But let's just look at the different weaknesses proposed for the Almighty. So the first one is the fairly obvious one, that his power must be transferred from himself when he falls asleep to a vessel, to Hashvolth. And Basby himself mentions that if he kills Hashvolth, if he destroys his body, he'll destroy the Almighty along with him, if Hashvolth currently has it. That seems like a pretty big weakness to me. You're giving your most godlike power to someone who is realistically nowhere near as strong as you for an extended period of time. But there are deeper weaknesses than that. There's obviously Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu. Now this one I think only works because Aizen was lucky enough to activate his Zanpakuto and put Yhwach under his spell before his powers reawakened. So we know that Yhwach goes and meets Aizen during the first Quincy invasion, and during this time Aizen puts his spell on him to begin altering his senses. We know that the Kyoka Suigetsu allows Aizen the power of complete hypnosis, Kanzen Saimin, which basically gives him utterly and total control over all 5 senses. It's not unreasonable to think that Yhwach kind of maybe forgets about this and he awakens his eyes, not remembering or even not really being able to do anything about the fact that he has awoken his true sight while being under the influence, the everlasting influence of Kyoka Suigetsu, which you can assume would only ever disappear if Aizen either willed it or was killed. So when Yhwach gains the Almighty back, when he gets all these irises, even when he goes as far as to absorb the power of the Soul King, which is actually given really cool visual flair, I think. It does look a little ridiculous on the surface, but I like what Kubo's going for. When Yhwach takes the power of the Soul King for his own, it is visualized literally as an eldritch black mass, an abomination of a net of spider-like eyes draped all over Yhwach's face like a liquid, giving off this tar-like ooze, which I think is just a really cool way of showcasing an overflowing nature of power. But back to the weakness at hand, Yhwach, even when he gains this new ability, when he absorbs his father's powers, he's still under the power of Kyoka Suigetsu. There's really nothing he can do about that. So even though he can see all futures as though they were grains of sand before him, each of those futures has been warped by Aizen's illusions. So it makes total sense that Kyoka Suigetsu would work on this character. Unfortunately for Aizen and everyone else involved, Yhwach is so powerful that it doesn't matter that they get one up on him because he literally rewrites his own death. Which I think is probably the craziest thing we see the Almighty do, and realistically that's about as crazy as it could possibly get, because it means that Yhwach is effectively immortal. It makes a lot of sense though, because Yhwach, presumably the way this worked is when Ichigo was revealed to Yhwach as being the real one, and he stabbed him in the back and then cuts him in half. In that split second, I assume Yhwach looked at that future, saw himself being cut in half, saw himself being killed, and rewrote it so that he would emerge once again. That seems to be the only way that would make sense to me. Another of Yhwach's weaknesses is Tsukishima's Book of the End. Yhwach's the Almighty is a very forward-thinking power. It really only affects things in front of him in the timeline, the future. But Tsukishima's power goes backwards and affects the past. So I think this is kind of like a knock-on effect. Basically, Yhwach has done something in the future. In this instance, he's shattered Ichigo's Bankai. And then from that point on, if you kind of imagine it like Yhwach's on a treadmill, for example. So Yhwach's always walking forwards. He smashes Ichigo's Bankai in the future. The broken Bankai goes backwards into the past on the treadmill. So Ichigo now sees that he has this shattered Bankai and there's nothing he can do about it. And normally, Yhwach would just keep on walking forwards because that means nothing to him anymore. But unbeknownst to Yhwach, Tsukishima is waiting at the very back of the treadmill, and Ichigo's broken Bankai comes towards him in the past. He fixes it using Book of the End, so it was never shattered in the past. So in the past, at the back of the treadmill, you have this brand spanking new Tensa Zangetsu, which then goes back around again, so that Yhwach ends up facing it again in the future. It is a little complicated. These concepts are pretty weird, but that's what the Almighty does. That's what it's all about. It's supposed to be dealing with godlike paradoxes, godlike powers. But for me, that seems like a decent way of explaining it. A while ago, I did a video looking at both Aizen and Tsukishima and how they both acted as counters to Yhwach, so if you're interested, I would recommend checking that one out as well. And then finally, and potentially the most important of all the weaknesses, is I think this is really the only one that is presumably used in Yhwach's final moments to actually defeat this guy, is Uryu's antithesis shrift. Now, the antithesis allows Uryu to very simply reverse anything that has happened between two people over a space of time. And it is never mentioned that Uryu is actually using the antithesis in this final showdown, but a lot of people have presumed that he is because it's really the only way it makes sense. So Uryu comes out of nowhere and shoots Yhwach through the back with a still silver arrow, which will rob him of all his powers temporarily. Now, the argument, of course, is why didn't Yhwach see Uryu coming? Why didn't he see the arrow coming? If he can literally see all futures, how has he not seen this? And so for me, the only answer that makes any sense is that Uryu used the antithesis prior to this to reverse everything happening squarely between him and Yhwach. Basically, what's already happening is that Yhwach can see Uryu in the future, so Uryu's antithesis reverses that and makes it so that Yhwach can't see Uryu in the future. So basically, it does make sense when you break it down like that. You look at all of these futures that Yhwach is seeing, Uryu is appearing in all of them, shooting him with an arrow, and then suddenly he's not. Suddenly he is just wiped clean, and there's no record of Uryu anymore in Yhwach's futures. And so that explains to me at least why he was able to get hit in the back with the arrow. It is a little bit tricky to kind of wrap one's head around all of this ability as a whole. Like I said, it is pretty messy. And I think in many places, Kubo went a little overboard with how complicated things needed to be. But on the whole, I think the Almighty does work. You just need a little bit of outside explanation. Now, in Can't For Your Own World, the Soul King's version of the Almighty is actually taken a little bit further to places where I'm not sure it really makes sense. They move beyond this idea of precognition and the ability to see the future and instead make it so that the Almighty is quite literally the Soul King's godly powers, to the point where the Almighty is what's later used to regulate souls and essentially allow all of the Bleach universe to continue running normally. The Almighty is the power of the Soul King that the 5 Noble House ancestors used to split the primordial world they exist in into the 3 worlds we know today. And so it's kind of weird. It feels like the Almighty in the novel is used as a bit of a catch-all explanation for how some of these things actually happen. But again, the Soul King, he's supposed to be a god, so I think it's probably alright. But that's pretty much it for our deep dive look at the ability of the Almighty. It is really a crazy power, the craziest Bleach I think has ever seen. Easily the most powerful thing in the entire series with near limitless potential. Yhwach rewriting his own death to avoid death is, like I said, probably the craziest thing we get to see out of it in the series, but presumably he could theoretically do that forever and ever, so he's basically unkillable. And it is pretty neat that even, 10 years later, he still comes back in some form because that is a future that he had essentially created. I think that is pretty neat, and he's gone basically forever. His power is, the last vestiges, as Aizen says, of his power is destroyed when he comes into contact with Kazui Kurosaki. If Kubo decides again to continue Bleach with this supposed Hell arc, I'd like to see Yhwach back in some form if possible, or at least get some kind of closure about the Almighty in general. I think it is such a world-breaking ability that we needed a little more on it. But what we did get, I think, makes enough sense. It's just, it is a pretty wild power. Firstly, allowing Yhwach to see all and know all, and then in the future, allowing him to change all. Basically, allowing him to alter the future as he pleases. But that's it for this video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of the Almighty as an ability. Did you like it? Do you think it's maybe a little too overpowered? And what do you think about its weaknesses as well? Do they make sense to you? And how do you feel about how Yhwach was defeated in Bleach? Make sure to subscribe if you haven't done already, guys. And until next time, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.